Hey everybody, we're now at video number 33 and we're marching through time. We're now in the 3rd and 4th century, 5th century. We're going to be looking at a very critical time for the development of the Eucharistic liturgy in the West, and we're going to have a few references to other places as well in the East. You really can't separate completely East and West at this point because there's so much interchange going on, there's so much back and forth. It's still a world where the connections are strong. The Roman world hasn't completely fallen apart yet, so travel is safe and you have an international civilization. So that has an impact on the liturgy and the exchanges that go on during this period. First, let's talk about the 3rd century. The 3rd century, when you start from 120 in the upper room in 30 AD, if you start calculating 40% growth every 10 years, net growth, 40% growth net every 10 years. Early on, the growth is going to be small. It's not going to be all that noticeable. But once you get to the 3rd century, the growth really, 40% every 10 years is huge in terms of numbers. And we see a great growth in the life of the church. For the first time in the late 3rd century, the church actually constitutes a pretty significant percentage of the Roman Empire. So it's now not just on the fringe anymore. And as a result, in 260 AD, after a very horrible persecution where the emperor who was at the head of this persecution seems to be severely judged by God. He's the only emperor who ever gets captured in battle and who disappears. The Parthians capture him. And at the end of this persecution, his son, who becomes emperor, decides to legalize Christianity. So in 260 AD, there's what looks like the end of persecution. And so Christians now, they have a number of people, they have bigger numbers, they need church buildings, so they start erecting them legally. And so there are some church buildings going on now. And we actually don't have a lot of info about a lot of these churches. One of them, thank God, is actually preserved for us because the town was destroyed. And there's a synagogue right near a church, a Christian place of worship, and both those things were buried under the rubble, kind of like a Pompeii sort of situation. And then finally, they were able to be excavated. So we actually know something about a church building, at least, in Syria. And it's very much like a synagogue. It's set up very much in the pattern of a synagogue with a bema, or a place from which the word is read. There's a chair, that seems like the chair of Moses in a synagogue where the president of the assembly sits. There's benches for the elders, so anyway, it looks a lot like a synagogue in this place. But we also find that there are basilicas that are erected. And so I just need to mention what a basilica is real quick. A basilica is simply a Roman imperial building. Basileia is the word, basilous is the word for a king in Greek, or the emperor in Greek. So a basilica is a government or imperial building, a building of the king. And it's rectangular with, usually there's 2 sets of columns running down it, so it has this big central nave that we would call it, and then 2 aisles. And at the wall, the end of the wall from the entrance, farthest from the entrance in this rectangle, there'll be a raised platform and there'll be a chair, and this is called the apse above it, but there's a chair where the magistrate sits. Anyway, rectangular building like that, where public meetings were held, where public audiences were held, that's the model of churches. And some of those were built. And unfortunately, in 303, there's a renewed persecution, and they're all destroyed. Any basilica that was standing was knocked down. So anyway, this is just a little bit about where things are in the 3rd century. We don't have tons of great documents of what the liturgy was like in the 3rd century. But the 4th century is a whole different story. 4th century sees the legalization of Christianity in 313 in the Edict of Milan. Now, this does not make the church the state religion. That's a misconception. But it is preferred because Constantine himself deems himself a Christian, although he's not baptized until his deathbed. And we'll find out more about that and why that happened later. But anyway, for now, we'll just say this, that church buildings are being built like crazy. And the first church buildings were actually built by the emperor in this era. And why did he do that at public expense? It's real simple. It was restitution for the church buildings destroyed wrongly by the government, but also property seized. When people were captured, the martyrs did not just get martyred, they had everything they owned confiscated. So if you got off easy, you could just have everything confiscated. So imagine what that would be like for you now in terms of home, retirement savings, everything is taken by the government, and that's a light punishment. And you could also be tortured, or you could be also martyred. But anyway, confiscation. So the government used to love to enrich its treasury by forfeiting all the property of any criminal, including the Christians. So anyway, Christians being persecuted by confiscation of property, destruction of things. The government also seized sacred vessels, seized scriptures when they could. But anyway, Constantine felt injustice in restitution that the government owed it to Christians to build basilicas. So it built St. Peter's in Rome. It built St. Paul's outside the walls. Of course, not the ones that we know now. They've been rebuilt. But the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, these are built all across the empire. Now, we're going to talk more about this later, but I want to just deal with one issue that is important to deal with because it's in the news today, or it's kind of a controverted issue. And that is the issue of orientation, or the church facing east. Were early church buildings built facing east? Well, yes and no. Early Christians, was it a tradition to pray facing east? And the answer is yes. And we find it in many, many places. It's not strong scriptural support for it, but there is scriptural inspiration for it. What is the inspiration? Well, it says in Matthew that Jesus is going to return like lightning flashes from the east to the west. It also says in Malachi that he is the Son of Righteousness will come with healing in its wings. And we also find in Zechariah's canticle in Luke 1 that the dawn from on high shall break upon us. So Christ is seen as the Son of Righteousness, the dawn from on high, the one who will return as lightning flashes from the east to the west. So the east came to be, for Christians, a sign of Jesus' second coming. So praying toward the east is eschatological. It's expectant faith in the coming of Jesus. It's also a distinctively Christian sign because Jews, and most early Christians were Jews originally, or they were Gentile converts or God-fearers, as we've already heard. But in a synagogue, you would face Jerusalem. So facing east is a sign of Christian distinctiveness. Now, we're no longer facing Jerusalem. We're facing east, the place from which the Lord will come. Okay, so this is the meaning behind praying to the east. And you can see in the 3rd century, do see Origen. We don't see him talking about a church building, but we just see the idea of Christ as the true east, the true orient. Very, very heavy light symbolism in the scriptures and in the early church and in the liturgy, So the coming of light from the east. Remember, in baptism, you faced east to profess your faith. You faced west first, though, to renounce Satan. So east-west, early Christians had much greater sense of this kind of directional symbolism of sunrise, sunset. They also had a pagan background in the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 3rd century. The cult of the unconquered sun became very widespread in Rome and in the Roman Empire, and it was carried everywhere by soldiers, among whom it was very popular. So there were a lot of pagans who faced to the east as well and reverenced the sun. In fact, we find some criticism, some concern on the part of Pope Leo about this, and that's in the 5th century. And it's interesting, a very interesting thing. Early churches were built on an east-west axis, but many of them face west. Interesting. So St. Peter's Basilica faces west. Now, one of the fascinating things about this is the table of the altar. The altar was both a table and an altar of sacrifice, but that was put not against the Western Wall. It's put, if you go to St. Peter's today, you'll see the church is built in the form of a cross, and it's where the upper bar and the cross piece meet, where the altar is, and is covered by a baldacchino, which is a great bronze structure now. But anyway, the point is, traditionally, the Pope faced the people, and in so doing, he was facing east. The people were facing west. So anyway, there was even a sense of the priests facing east in churches that were built this way. The point I'm just trying to make here is that the early churches that were built were not all facing east. There was a custom of praying towards the east. There are times when wherever the church was facing, when the president said a prayer, he would face east. So it could mean facing away, towards the people. It could be facing towards the apse. But the key wasn't facing away or toward the people. It was facing east. And that was the original meaning of all this. And we have some churches that were built in the round as well. And we also have mainly churches, excuse me, I'm going to take that back. Forget about that. There were churches that were built octagonally. They were built in the shape of an octagon. Many baptistries were built octagonally, but also many churches. And the altar would not be against a wall, it would be in the center, even though there was a very clear indication as to where east was. So anyway, there's a lot of diversity in early church buildings, and you have to keep in mind early Roman cities at this time were all built on an east-west axis. So you had Romans were oriented. One of the main roads was east-west always. And so, orientation has some cultural background. It has some symbolism. It didn't have a universal impact on exactly how churches were built, whether facing east or west. Okay, so there's just a little history about the first churches. So there are different. There's a lot of diversity, and still there's this sense of the symbolism of East. So let's move on to the issue of liturgical pomp and circumstance. One of the things that Constantine did very early, right away, was he made the bishops as leaders of community, of important community, and sizable community. There are 6 million Christians out of 60 million in the empire in the time of Constantine. So you got 10% of the population Christian. That's a huge number of people. So anyway, Constantine made the bishops magistrates. He made them officials of the Roman Empire who had a function to judge court cases of Christians. So if a Christian had a court case against another, it'd be judged by the bishop. If a Christian had a court case against a pagan, it was judged by the bishop. It was only pagans suing pagans that got judged by pagan, secular officials. So this is very, very momentous. Even though Christianity is not the official religion, now its leaders are magistrates, and magistrates had special insignia and privileges. And this is where a lot of a lot of things that found their way into the liturgy, found their way in at this time, and it was out of honor of the bishop as magistrate. So what do I mean by this? The pallium was for magistrates. So it's a Roman secular symbol of authority that later acquires much more Christian symbolism. It is given to archbishops, and it goes around the neck, and there's a strip of cloth down the front and the back with little black crosses on it. So this pallium is a sign of episcopal authority, but it originates as a sign of a magistrate. Also, a magistrate would walk through the town always with attendants. He has a person. He's an illustrious person. There's actually a word for it. Illustres were the illustrious people, and so they were carried on litters sometimes. So you have this survived until Pope Paul VI. I don't think the popes now allow themselves to be carried on litters, but I saw Paul VI in 1975 in Rome, in St. Peter's, and he's a very old man, and he's being carried on a litter. And that was part of the way Roman great magistrates were honored. But they also were preceded by someone carrying a sign of authority. And the secular authority was a bundle of sticks with an axe in the middle, symbolizing life or death authority of a magistrate. Of course, our bishops didn't want that, but instead they substituted a cross. So the processional cross that we use in the liturgy actually was carried through the streets before a bishop. And a bishop also, as a magistrate, had the right and the privilege of having his hand kissed or his feet kissed. And so this got into the liturgy. So where does the Pope get, where, you know, that perdured mostly with bishops and priests until very recently, that we kiss their hand oftentimes. How about kissing the ring? The Roman magistrate had a ring of authority. So this is where some of this stuff comes from, and it comes in right now. So, you know, liturgy is going to change significantly once the bishop has these kinds of privileges. Also, the entrance song. The emperor, when he came into a place, was greeted by a choir singing. There was also incense carried in the procession with the emperor. So all these things, you know, it really began here. Of course, there was incense in the Jewish temple. And later on, we look at the incense as having nothing to do with the bishop's honor. It has to do with the prayers of the saints ascending, as it does in Revelation. But I'm just telling you historically how these things actually made their way into the liturgy. And the liturgy gets much higher, you know, high church at this point, because of the elevated status of bishops, who are the main celebrants. And in the 4th century, it's still the bishop's mass by and large. You know, priests can, of course, celebrate the Eucharist, but the paradigm of the Eucharist in the early church is the bishop's Eucharist, and the priests assembling around him, with him, the deacons assisting with him. And we'll see this lasts as a paradigm for many hundreds of years. But you see that very, very strongly here, very strongly. One of the other things that happens in the 4th century, between the bishop being made a magistrate with all this pomp and fighting against the Arians and having to insist on the exalted status of Jesus as God. He's always been worshipped as God, don't get me wrong, you know that from Theology 503. But the emphasis now gets very, very strong, and when we get the image of Christ, the early images of Christ that you will find in the catacombs. You'll have the Good Shepherd, you have lots of images from the Gospels. You'll also have, there's one image of Christ as Apollo, the sun god, kind of going through heaven on a chariot. You find that under St. Peter's. That's kind of a fascinating thing to see. But Christ the Good Shepherd's very common. But what now, Christ the universal King in heaven, glorious, the ruler of all, Pantocrator. That's what that word means, and there's a lot of beautiful icons of the Pantocrator. And you'll see in the Roman basilicas with 5th century frescoes that still exist, for example, in St. Paul outside the walls. This is Christ glorious on his throne, and even you'll find a lot of imperial insignia for Christ. So, you know, that is a very strong emphasis. So, you know, adoration of Christ becomes something that we see in a lot more in the Eastern liturgy. It's interesting. In the Roman liturgy that we see in Hippolytus, the prayer is made to the Father through Christ. And that's the basic, you know, prayer of the early church, of the Roman liturgy. In the East now, you start seeing Christ addressed in liturgical prayer. If you notice, you know, there's no Gloria, and the Gloria originally and the Holy, Holy, Holy is applying to the Father. But now we find the Benedictus gets added to the Holy, Holy. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest. Well, that's really directed to Christ. You know, glory to God in the highest is originally directed to Christ. And we see that Gloria now appearing in the 4th century. So anyway, the idea of Christ's exalted majesty, the bishop's majesty, there's much more of a sense of awe and majesty that we see in the 4th century liturgy that starts to become predominant, okay? So how about language in the liturgy? There's something funny that happens in the culture of the empire. All of you know that the empire is divided in two administratively in the late 3rd century because it's too big to rule. And that division is actually a reflection of something that is happening culturally already. And the division accelerates the development of a distinct culture in the East and the West. The East, even the Roman court, which comes to be in Constantinople, it becomes much more culturally Greek, and it stays Greek and celebrates its Greekness there. And so in the West, even though Greek had been the lingua franca in the main cities for a long time, that starts to get lost. Even intellectuals start to lose their grasp on Greek. Just like, a lot of intellectuals in this country grew up learning Greek and Latin, whether they be Protestant or Catholic, classical education. But that started to really wane in the 60s. And nowadays, it's very rare to find anybody who's schooled in the Greek or the Greek and Latin classics. Very few people. But that was very common earlier. Well, the same kind of thing happened in the 3rd century, the late 3rd century. So more and more people now in Rome can't understand Greek. Their language is Latin. It becomes increasingly the vernacular. So around the year 300, we find the inscriptions in the catacombs switching from Greek to Latin. And the liturgy, though, we don't know the exact, we'd love to know more about, is there a transition gradually? Does part of the liturgy gets translated into Latin, early? We don't know, but we know this, that it wasn't until 380 in the reign of Damasus, Pope Damasus, that the Eucharistic prayer goes from Greek to Latin. We know that because people were quoting it, excerpts of it were quoted, not complete texts, unfortunately, but excerpts were quoted around 360, 370 in Greek, and then in 385, the people who quoted in Latin. So we know that it was right in there in Pope Damasus' reign, and Pope Damasus also commissioned Jerome to provide more dignified Latin texts of the Gospels and of the Psalms, while Jerome was his deacon in Rome. So that's another tip-off that the transition happens in 380. But it's complete. It's absolutely complete. There's nothing left in Greek, despite the fact that it's the language of the New Testament. It had been the language of prayers of the ancestors who died for their faith in the catacombs, and buried there, and we honor them there. But they died in the arena. There's no sense that we've got to hold on to this ancient liturgical language. So the transposition is complete. And you'll say, well, what about the Kyrie? That's in Greek, right? Well, the Kyrie wasn't added until later. It was added back in later on in Greek. So we have no evidence that the Kyrie was ever prayed in Rome prior to the transposition of the whole liturgy into Latin. So it's a real serious adaptation. It's a new inculturation. It's important to know that this word, is kind of a new word. It's an official word used in magisterial documents after the council. It was not used at Second Vatican Council. But it's a very important idea, and that is that a liturgy in the life of the church needs to take shape and be kind of incarnated in a culture, so it's inculturated. So there's a big this is a good example of, in the history of the church, the vernacular principle ruling again, like it did in the 1st century. So the liturgy is translated into Latin thoroughly, and the culture of the Church of Rome becomes Latin. Now, it was probably preceded. Rome is the most conservative place in the church when it comes to slowness to change. In North Africa, it seems that it probably happened earlier, because the switch from Greek to Latin happened earlier. Greek was never as firmly entrenched in places like Carthage and Hippo as it was in Rome and in Antioch and even in Lyon, which is now France. But anyway, what we find is probably North Africa happened earlier. It seems like it happened earlier, a little bit earlier, maybe a few decades earlier, in Milan under the great Ambrose. But nonetheless, the church, the culture is still very Eastern compared to what we're used to. And we'll find that out in a minute when we talk about music, okay? So anyway, this is a very important thing for us to understand. The church did make a very significant translation into the vernacular twice in the first 4 centuries. Once into Greek, and that stayed for 300 years, and then into Latin. Okay, so we need to talk about some other things. In this new, we don't have a text of the Eucharistic prayer as used in the 4th century for sure, that comes from the 4th century. But the Roman canon that we have now is very, very much likely to reflect a lot of 4th century language and themes. So we're just going to take the Roman canon that we have now, and we'll see that there's a very heavy emphasis on sacrifice, much heavier than we found in the prayer of Hippolytus. And just remember, Hippolytus's prayer is his prayer that he proposes as a model. It's not the prayer that was prayed, in Rome for sure. So we don't know what the Greek anaphora or Eucharistic prayer was like exactly, and so we can't make too many conclusions here. But what we can say is this: there's a very heavy emphasis on sacrifice in the Roman canon, and the language of the Roman canon. The themes are very Jewish. Melchizedek, may your angel take the sacrifice to your altar in heaven. That's very, very Jewish. The repetition of words and synonyms, this holy victim, this spotless victim, that's very Jewish to repeat that like that. But on the other hand, the language of the Roman canon is the language of Latin of late antiquity, and it's very juridical, and it's very punctilious and exact, and it's very non-emotional, and it doesn't use lots and lots of images, even though this Eucharistic prayer using images is really a reflection of the Jewish roots of the Eucharist and the Eucharistic prayer. What we now know as Eucharistic Prayer 1. But generally speaking, the Latin language and style is very, very precise and juridical and restrained. And we're going to see a little bit more about of this in a minute. I'm going to read you a collect, and I'm going to compare it to a prayer from the Maronite liturgy, and you'll kind of see a little bit more what I mean. Okay, so the prayer is still addressed to the Father through Christ, very Jewish, Christian, and very conservative, and that is the original way that all the ancient canons were and still are. The prayer is generally in the Roman liturgy. The original prayer was not addressed to Christ much, and this is true in Latin Christianity in general. Why is that? Because in the East there was tremendous controversy. Remember, the Arian controversy was mainly an Eastern controversy initially. It was not in Rome and North Africa. Later on, it's a problem. Wherever the barbarians went, most of them brought Arian Christianity with them. So it becomes a problem later in the West. But early on, the West has no problem with the divinity of Christ. And so it doesn't have to super emphasize it because it's assumed. In the East, they got to really push it. So a prayer gets addressed to Christ, and interestingly enough, in the West, it's resisted. There's councils of Carthage that kind of say, "Don't, we're not going to do that." In the 4th century, two councils of Carthage, because it's an Eastern usage that is not traditional as far as Latin Christianity is concerned. All right, so we're going to see that Latin Christianity yields on this later, but at least now, prayers in the Roman liturgy are still addressed to the Father through Christ. So how about music? Can we say anything about music in the church in this period? And the answer is yes, because the earliest musical notation in the history of Western civilization is that of St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose, there's chant that bears his name, and honestly, he did have a whole lot to do with it. He actually wrote lyrics to hymns. Now, the hymn was an innovation from the East. Roman Christianity, Latin Christianity chanted the Psalms, but didn't have poetic hymns. Remember, Latin Christianity is a little reserved about poetry and imagery and stuff. So the Psalms, okay, there's poetry and imagery there, and that's inspired, but we don't necessarily need hymns. So St. Paul was very into hymns. And the East was into hymns, but Rome and Carthage didn't seem to buy that right away. But Ambrose was the innovator who actually wrote hymns as in the style of the East, poetic songs about Christ and about the faith, and addressed to Christ as well as to the Father. So we actually can read several of these now, but the actual style of chant has been preserved since the 4th century in Milan, and it's called Ambrosian chant. So I encourage you guys to listen to that. I think we're putting some of that as background into the videos here. But also you can go on YouTube and actually bring up Ambrosian chant. You won't find it on Spotify, unfortunately. Everyone thinks Gregorian chant is the only chant. But Gregorian, as we know it now, comes from much later. And I would tend to think that the Ambrosian chant probably is what Roman chant sounded a lot like in the 4th century. To us now, it sounds very Eastern, very Greek or Middle Eastern. It sounds very different from Gregorian chant, I think. So listen to it, and it's fascinating. Thank God we have it. We don't have any liturgical books from the Western churches from the 4th century that were written, we know for sure, written in the 4th century. So that's a shame that we don't have that. But we keep looking, and new things are always, discovered all the time. So who knows? Maybe we'll discover a little bit more. The West includes Gaul. Spain is inhabited at this point by Gauls in the north. Gauls are Celts. And Germanic tribes are coming into the West. But in the 4th century, largely, we're talking, France is called Gaul, and good part of northern Spain is Gaul. And those folks are evangelized, it seems, initially by people from Syria. That's fascinating. We know, Paul wanted to go to Spain, and he's coming from the east. He's coming from what's now Turkey, Antioch, the missionary base of Paul is in Syria. So it seems we don't know who did it, but we know that it was the East that missionized these places rather than the community of Rome initially. And therefore, there's lots of Eastern usages that we find in the early liturgy in Gaul. The relationship between Gaul and the East keeps up for many, many years. But anyway, a very, very important point is that the monasteries in Gaul are not celebrating the liturgy as it's celebrated in Rome. They're celebrating a liturgy that's from the East. And Patrick is converted in the 400s, a little bit after the 4th century, early 5th century. And he goes to a monastery off the coast of France, and there he learns Gallic liturgy. And the liturgy that he grew up with, he was a descendant of, I think his father was a deacon, if I'm not mistaken, if not a presbyter. But the liturgy that he would have grown up with, and the liturgy that he was mentored in the monastery, is an Eastern sort of liturgy. And his rule is a lot like the rules of the East in terms of his monastic rule. But anyway, he goes to Ireland, and the Irish monks are really spreading as they missionize all over Northern Europe. They bring the gospel all over the place. They're spreading a liturgy that's Gallican and goes back to Syria. So it has a lot of Eastern elements to it. And I bring this up because the Roman liturgy is going to encounter the Gallican liturgy later, and we're going to see what happens when it does. By the way, Gaelic comes from the word Gaul. So Gaelic is another word for Gaulish or Celtic. Some of you know that that's typically the way in which the Irish language is described. Okay, there's something else in the 4th century that's pretty awesome, and that is, this is the age of the catechumenate, the classic golden age, where we actually have from Augustine, from Ambrose, and from Cyril of Jerusalem, we have instructions that were delivered by the bishops and by priests and catechists. We don't know how many lay catechists are involved in this, but we know in Jerusalem, Cyril himself, who seems to be a presbyter at the time and later becomes bishop, Cyril is the one giving the instruction to the catechumens around the year 350. And his catechetical instructions and mystagogical instructions after baptism are a goldmine. They tell us a lot, and they give us a hint of what's in the liturgy a little bit. They try to explain for the catechumens, actually not for the catechumens, for the newly baptized right after they're given the gift of the Spirit. Remember, they weren't seen, they couldn't come to the Eucharist in the 4th century, at least the liturgy of the Eucharist, until they were baptized. And there was no doctrinal teaching really about the Eucharist and about baptism until after they'd received the sacraments. They weren't deemed to be able to understand the mysteries until they'd received the enlightenment of the Spirit. So anyway, the mystagogical lectures of Ambrose and of Cyril tell us a lot about the liturgy in the 4th century in Jerusalem and in Milan. And we get a little bit also from Augustine and in his catechetical instructions. So they're not trying to, explain to us the full layout of the liturgy. They're trying to tell the catechumens, the new Christians, newly baptized Christians, they're trying to tell them what these things mean in the liturgy. So we're just going to take a look at a couple of things from Jerusalem. First of all, 350 AD, we see the Sanctus is in the liturgy of Jerusalem. And we believe that it also made its way into the Roman liturgy around this time. And maybe, very, very possibly, because of pilgrimages to Jerusalem. We know that Helena and we know that Constantine loved making, they were the ones who went, well, Constantine couldn't get to Jerusalem because of the Council of Nicaea, so he sent his mom. But pilgrimage to Jerusalem was very important in the 4th century. Among the newly Christianized emperor and the noble Christians of the age, those who could afford to, went there. And even people who weren't of great means went there to Jerusalem. And so we have actually a travel log of one of them written around the year 400, the end of the 4th century, Egeria. And she tells us about all the ceremonies in Jerusalem. Well, pilgrims going to Jerusalem brought back those customs. They brought them back to Gaul, and they brought them back, at least some of them, to Rome. But remember, Rome was very conservative about adopting new things, as was Carthage and St. Augustine's area, North Africa. And they were a little bit more reserved, a little slower to embrace some of the new things, but they still embraced the Sanctus, and they embraced the Gloria in the 4th century, as far as we can tell. And they embraced a little bit later the Kyrie litany. That we hear about the Kyrie litany being prayed. Egeria tells us about it being prayed when she was at the liturgy in Jerusalem. Not necessarily the Eucharistic liturgy, but this litany of Kyrie eleison, she talks about it and she translates it into Latin because she's writing in Latin. So anyway, we get these glimpses into the liturgy. We see Cyril of Jerusalem instructing the people about communion in the hand and how to receive it reverently, making your hands like a throne. So this is the way people were receiving. This is how they're being instructed to receive reverently in the hand. We also see the sign of peace being instructed. What does it mean? Jesus saying, if you're on your way to the altar and you remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar, go back, reconcile with your brother first, then you can offer a pleasing sacrifice. Well, the early church understood this to be an instruction about the Eucharist. So the kiss of peace was always before the Eucharist as a sign and testament to one another, to myself, to God, that I am holding nothing against anyone, so I am free to go to the altar. So this is how Cyril teaches it. I'm just going to stop and say, one of the problems with the sign of peace is no one is ever told what it means and why it's there. If I hadn't read this stuff, I wouldn't know. I wasn't instructed. I've never heard, honestly, a deacon or priest or a bishop instruct anyone on the meaning of the sign of peace, which I think is criminal. It's negligence in my opinion, and that's one of the reasons why some people are very impatient with it, because they see it as backslapping fellowship time that interrupts our focus on God in the liturgy. Well, that's not what it means. And if it degenerates into that, then then it's a problem. But we need to restore what it means if we're going to do it. And even if we don't do it, we got to tell everybody that no one should come to the altar unless they have forgiven, because that's the meaning of it. Even if we can't, in times of infectious disease, we can't exchange it, or if you go to the extraordinary form of the Mass and it's not done, you still need to, spiritually, when you say the Our Father, know that forgiveness is something that you are pledging before God in order to receive His mercy and to be disposed for His grace. Okay, so there's some beautiful things here that we see. We see the Our Father in the liturgy, and we see that it's before communion because, again, this is in the 4th century now. This makes its way into Rome as well. Probably in the 4th century. But the idea of the Our Father again is, first of all, you can't say it unless you're baptized. It's a prayer of sonship. And it's also a prayer of reconciliation. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Okay, so let's look at one other document before we close our discussion of the 4th century, and that is the Apostolic Constitutions. Now you're going to see how lex orandi, lex credendi. Here, the author here betrays where he stands in the 4th century. He is part of a semi-Arian or Arianizing group of Christians. So he's sharing what he says is from the apostles, but he shares a Gloria. It's one of the first times we see a Gloria. But the Gloria is addressed to God the Father. And we know from Egypt at this time that the Gloria, the exact text almost that we use today in Rome, we see it as part of morning prayer in Egypt. This is what St. Athanasius tells us. There it's addressed to Christ. So we see that, there are two different groups that are using the Gloria differently. One as a confession of glory, a series of acclamations. By the way, it's a very Eastern prayer, and it's a series of cheers, of acclamations. We praise you, we bless you, we adore you, we glorify you. Okay, it's very Eastern, it's very Semitic, and it's very much a prayer of acclamation and glory, a series of acclamations strung together. And the angelic praise is very prominent in Jewish worship. So here, the glory to God in the highest, which is right out of Luke's gospel, it may not be Jewish in its origin, but it's Jewish in its style of praising the angels with us in worship. We're entering into their worship. And you see that that's already a note in the Eucharist, in the Sanctus. But it gets into morning prayer in the Gloria. It's originally a morning prayer, and then that gets incorporated into the formatter of the Mass. And one thing I'll just tell you is, in Rome, remember the reserve of the Roman style, tremendous reserve. So let's just point out that, the sobriety of Roman culture dictates that, okay, we're going to use the Gloria. It's nice, but only the Pope can intone it. So other ministers can't intone it. So just a presbyteral Mass by a priest can't use it. And we're only going to use it on solemn, high occasions. So it's only used for Christmas and Easter. And it's only way later that it starts being used for Sundays other than Lent and Advent. And it can be intoned by a priest. So it's just kind of interesting to just watch the reserve with which Rome yields to this kind of festive spirit, exuberant spirit, because the Gloria is an exuberant prayer. All right. So here's what we're seeing. We're seeing critical assimilation. We're seeing that the cultures in the church are not just, Rome doesn't just stay Rome and Latin in its culture. It has its Latin trunk, but Eastern elements get grafted in as the church sees the goodness of them. And it grafts it in according to its own culture. And certainly, the Gloria that's accepted by Rome is not the Arianizing one of the Apostolic Constitutions. It's the Christological one from Alexandria. So, that's interesting to just see, the church critically, when it comes to doctrine, it's assimilating. There's an enculturation going on. There's grafting in that's going on of shoots from the Eastern liturgy. And they all go really back to Jerusalem anyway, so we're all related anyway. It's kind of like intermarriage of families is what we see going on here. So it's kind of beautiful to see. And we also see the Kyrie eleison here. We see that in the Apostolic Constitutions as well as in Egeria. So the Kyrie eleison, the Gloria, these things are now they're going to be making their way from the East to the West, enriching the Latin liturgy in Rome in the 4th century and early on into the 5th century.